back. So glad you're here. It's good times. All right, so this video is a continuation of a paper that I wrote for the European Journal for the Study of Thomas Aquinas that came out last fall, so fall of 2024. The paper is called The Logic of the Identity of Being and Goodness and a Moral Argument for Theism. In a previous video, I kind of introduced the way in which Aquinas' view of the identity of being and goodness, how it connects with a moral argument for theism. And in that video, I mentioned that the arguments that Aquinas has for the identity of being good, what I'm calling his 4 ways to good, are a precursor, or in my view, a necessary underpinning for any argument for theism that relies on moral reality. In other words, any moral argument for theism, in my view, needs to be undergirded with a metaphysics of the identity of being and goodness in things. Okay, so there's might call it not just a moral argument for theism, but a metaethical argument for theism. The metaphysics of the metaethics is what's really important, because I don't think you can get to morality as a foundation for an argument for theism unless you have it undergirded with a specific metaethics, which is grounded in a metaphysics, which is part and parcel of the identity of being and goodness that's found in Aquinas' works. And Aquinas has 4 arguments, at least 4 arguments, and these 4 arguments for the identity of being good in things. And these 4 arguments come to us from Aquinas' works, but if you want to see them argued and dissected a little bit or introduced, I would suggest a little article by Eleanor Stump and Norman Kreitzman in a book called Being and Goodness, edited by Scott McDonald. Came out quite some time ago. Can't remember the year, but it's worth taking a look at. Anyway, I've got some other videos that walk you through Aquinas' 4 ways to good. So I'm not going to repeat those here, even though they're included in the paper. I'll just mention them here. So there are 4 ways, and I'm calling these 4 ways. It's kind of, parallel to Aquinas' 5 ways to God. He's got 4 ways to good. So the first argument is an argument from desire, quote-unquote desire, or appetunt, or apheatai, in Greek, which is derived from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle quotes some of his precursor philosophers and says, it has been said that all things desire the good, or the good is which all desire. So I take that to be an identity claim. Not all philosophers may agree with this, but it seems like Aquinas treats it that way. And that Greek word apheatai, or apheatai, is the root of the root of that word. One way to translate it is aim at this, aiming at, like throwing something. You're throwing something that's goal directed. That's the way I interpret it, and I think there's some lexical justification for that. But it's often translated as appetunt in Latin, which is where we get our English word appetite, or it's also translated as desire. Now, I think appetite and desire are probably wrong-headed for English speakers, because appetite is usually associated with something gustatory. Kind of an appetite for carne asada burrito, or I've got an appetite for a double-double, or whatever. So I think appetite is misguided, because usually appetite sounds like something biological, and desire is even, I think, worse as a substitute for that Greek term apheatai, which is that we desire. Desires require, in my view, there's mere biological desires. Maybe animals can have desires, even lower animals can quote unquote desire things. Usually, desire requires a mental state. If I desire X, I am thinking about X, or have an awareness, or at least a possible awareness of X. So, but I don't think for the argument for the identity of being good, neither desire nor appetite is required. In other words, there are things which have neither of those things, natural appetites or natural desires, but still have apheatai. that is a directedness towards the achievement of their own ends, which are grounded in their necessary telos of their essential nature. And that if that's right, then everything that exists, if existence is essential exact actualization, or the actualization of essential nature, then anything that exists necessarily, when coming into being, fulfills its own desire, quote-unquote, desire or appetite, and atheita. So that's a longer story. So that's the first way, is the argument from desire. The second way is an argument from corruption resistance. And I think there's a good argument Aquinas has on that. The third way is an argument from essential teleology, or essential fulfillment. Again, here I try to make a distinction between two types of essential fulfillment, or essential teleology. One is just the coming into being of anything whatsoever. If coming into being requires the actualization of essential nature, necessarily anything that exists has already fulfilled that essential nature of its essence, which is possible, and then becoming actual or existing is a fulfillment of one type. Second type would be the continuation of that essential nature into its full actualization of its essential qualities, or the things that make it what it is. So Aquinas has that third way, and then the fourth way is an argument from aiming at being, which is similar to the first. So I'm not going to go through all the details of those arguments. I'm going to assume that they're valid, logically valid, and in fact sound. So I think what I'll do is then skip ahead in the paper, the structure of the paper. We'll skip ahead to the parts of the paper. We'll skip ahead from the going through all the details of the four ways. Again, I've got other videos on the channel for that, and we'll jump into the second major part of the paper, which is how the identity of being and goodness in Aquinas' four ways to good grounds a moral argument, or moral arguments in general for theism. Okay, so maybe I'll make it clear there's not just one moral argument for theism. There's a variety. Just like any argument for theism, there's going to be different types. Just like there's versions of the ontological argument. Plantinga has got his version, Anselm's got his version, maybe there are others. So too, if you want to, so too with the moral, I keep saying the moral arguments in general. If you want a nice history of this, look at David Baguette, and I think it's Jerry Walls' book called The Moral Argument of History, or Moral Arguments of History. It's a really good book, and if you're interested in that, it's a nice introduction to the varieties of moral arguments that have been developed over the last, I don't know, I think it's mostly modern arguments, but over the last few hundred years. What I want to do here, though, is show how, I'm assuming again that Aquinas' arguments are successful. I do defend that a little bit in the paper, and I think they're defensible. But what I want to do is then show, since those are sound, those arguments are sound, I want to apply them to moral arguments in general. Okay. So, in section 1, I outlined how Aquinas' four ways to good are logically valid and have some initial plausibility as to their soundness. The main conclusion of these four ways is this: being and good are identical in things. Because that's the key conclusion. Being and good are identical, secundum rem, in things themselves. We can distinguish them in our minds. The nature of that distinction, maybe there's some debate about that, but what that distinction consists in, is it a distinction of reason? Is it a sense of reference distinction? Are those the same? Or is it just a distinction between secundum according to the intellect, or according to things? Okay, so at least Aquinas maintains that distinction. Now, this is a profound statement, that things are identical, being and good are identical in things. This is a profound statement, and in my view, it's the only basis for a robust study of what philosophers call metaethics, which is in part a study of the nature of goodness. However, there's also another application, which I would like to explore here. It's an application of the broad area of metaethics, conceived as a study of the nature of goodness, but applied to what philosophers have called a moral argument for theism. So in this section, I'll show how Aquinas' conclusions that being and good are identical connects to and establishes a robust metaphysical grounding for moral arguments for theism. So I'll do this in this section, in three things in this section. The first thing I want to do is examine the claim that Aquinas' arguments indicate the possibility of a formal reality, the identity of being and goodness in things. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that if it's true that that being and goodness are identical in things, then anything that exists, anything that exemplifies an essential nature, has present within it a formal reality of the identity of being and good. In other words, it'd be almost like saying everything that's physical has extension. Therefore, there's a formal reality in every physical thing that has the quality of being extended. In other words, the quality of being extended is at least a formal reality. Maybe it can exist apart from the instances in which it shows itself up, but it's a formal reality. Okay, so second, I want to show how this formal reality connects Aquinas' fifth way to God. This is the last of his famous five ways argument to the existence of God. And third, I'll show that the formal reality implied by Aquinas' four ways to good, when combined with his fifth way to God, improves contemporary moral arguments for theism. So I want to try and improve contemporary moral arguments for theism, bolster them, make them more metaphysically robust. Okay, so first thing in this section, the identity of being and goodness implies a formal reality, existence identical to goodness. Okay, that's going to be a formal reality that's in anything that exists, especially those things that we know from our own experience, from human experience, the limits of human experience, natural reason and experience. One of the ways in which Aquinas follows Aristotelian metaphysics is in our knowledge of universals. Since Aristotle and Aquinas maintain that universals are really in the things that have them, in their instances, then when we experience reality, we experience a universal. In any experience of anything that's real, we are going to experience a universal. In addition, through our experience of multiple instances of the same universal, we can have knowledge of universals as abstract entities. This general metaphysics applies to logical realities as well. In Aquinas' four ways to good, these are the arguments that I didn't cover, I've covered in previous videos, we're presented with four particular arguments, each implying the same general conclusion. There is a real identity of being and goodness in things, idem secundum rem. Being and goodness differ only in idea, different secundum rationem, within our minds. Few things seem to follow from this. First, it follows that for any existing thing, there exists in that thing an instance of the reality, existence identical to goodness, or being identical to goodness. Thus, for multiple things, there will be many instances of the reality, existence is identical to goodness. This would be a reality that is present in everything that exists. So, in other words, anything that exists has this reality in it. It's like an instance of a general universal. Second, if there's a reality, existence identical to goodness, that is present in everything that is real, then it's at least possible, from certain understanding of universals, that there's a formal reality, existence identical to goodness, existing apart from the particulars that instantiate it. This would mean no different than say experiencing multiple instances of a red iron sphere, and concluding from this experience that there's a formal reality or university or quality of ironness, redness, and sphereness. This would mean that in any multiple objects O1 through O sub n, each object has the quality of having an identity relation between its being and its goodness. So being is identical to goodness is something that all things that exist have. This entails that being is identical to goodness is a universal that exists apart from its instances, at least as an object of thought, just as redness can be thought of as existing apart from its instances. If it exists apart from its instances, then it might explain what unifies all of the things which have it. Okay, so now, if this is right, again, there might be some debate here between Platonists and Aristotelians on the existence of a universal apart from its instances. Now, I take the debate, and I might be in a minority view here, that the debate between Aristotelians and Platonists is not that a universal exists in the instance. I think both of them maintain that. That is, both Aristotle and Plato maintain that universals exist in their instances. They differ over whether or not they exist unexemplified. Okay, but I think since we're operating here with these four ways to good, we are operating from our awareness of them in things that already exist, that it doesn't matter whether you're a Platonist or an Aristotelian, that you can both agree that if something is instantiated, that if a universal is instantiated in a thing, then it necessarily exists apart from the instance, because it's exemplified. Okay, now it might be a whole different debate, and if that's off, I don't think it matters too much to my argument. Okay. Third, if there is such a formal reality as existence identical to goodness, then this implies that whatever existence itself is, it is identical to good. And whatever goodness itself is, it is identical to existence. We can consider this in a formalized argument. Okay, so here's my formalized argument for this, this argument seems to flow from Aquinas' identity claims. So consider premise one. Premise one says, P, this proposition, being and good are really the same. Idem secundum rem, identical in things. Okay, so that's first premise. Second premise, P is true. That is, the proposition being and good are really the same, identical in things, is true. But if P is true, then P corresponds to reality. This relies on correspondence theory of truth. 4. If P corresponds to reality, then there must be a reality in any existing thing which consists of the identity relation, IR, the identity of goodness and being. But if IR really is in any existing thing, then IR will be in all existence, E1 through E sub n. And if E1 and E1 through E sub n exemplify IR, then one can abstract IR from E sub 1 through E sub n and think of IR formally. But if IR can be thought of formally, and given that IR exists in E1 through E sub n, then possibly IR is a formal reality that can exist apart from E1 through E sub n. And there are good reasons any argument for the formal realities existing separate from their instances would work here. To believe that IR exists apart from its instances. Now, I'm not going to provide that kind of argument, but I think it's possible to give. Therefore, there's good reason to believe that IR exists as a formal reality independently from E1 through E sub n. Okay, again, this argument is probably easier to follow in print than it is here on YouTube video. But what I'm after here is this idea that there exists a formal reality, identity of being and goodness, exists in anything that's real. Okay, so now if that's right, I've given a little argument for that here, then this can be applied to a moral argument for theism. So this argument would be certainly acceptable for a Platonist about universals. For an Aristotelian view, universals are real possibility, at least, such that one could say that if anything that exists, then IR exists in things and as an object of thought. One might then seek to explain the reality of the existence of IR. In any such explanation, one has explained both the existence of being and goodness. In addition, and most importantly for our purpose here, any such explanation of this type will be intimately connected with Aquinas' fifth way to God. And let's turn to that argument. Okay, I think I'll probably wrap this up here. Let me just make a couple comments. So again, the purpose of showing this formal reality that exists in anything that's real implies this, that to be is to be good. So in other words, there's no existing thing. There's nothing that exists which doesn't have goodness in it. So this is almost a connection between any type of cosmological argument that attempts to explain being is going to be deeply connected. In fact, it's going to necessarily demonstrate, if it works, that what exists is good. So in other words, if goodness and being are identical in things, and that applies to anything that exists, and there's this formal reality that applies to all existing things, then a moral argument for theism, now again, if we're talking about morality as applying only to human action, we're going to have to build that up from the identity of being and goodness in things and show how moral reality impinges upon the kinds of creatures that have wills and can engage in moral action. But if we're just doing a metaethical, then necessarily any argument for theism that relies on being will rely on good. And that's an interesting point, and I think an important one for a moral argument for theism. So what I want to do next then, and I think I'll have a separate video on this, is to show that the identity of being and good, considered with Aquinas' fifth way, relying on the formal reality, existence is identical to goodness, we can see that these results will directly apply to a moral argument for theism and undergird it in terms of its metaphysics and metaethics. That's where we're headed. All right. Thanks for watching.
Stay psyched, Grom. You.